Welcome back to the Wilburn Auditorium on the campus at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy in Malibu, California. I'm Ted McAllister, the Gaylord Chair and Professor of Public Policy here at Pepperdine. And we are about to enter our second conversation in our Roots of Education Policy conversation, in this case with Professor Margarita Mooney Suarez. In our first session, we discussed John Dewey and the problem of human nature. In this session, we'll highlight the work of French philosopher Jacques Maritain and his recovery of reality. Welcome back, Margarita. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Before we get into the weeds with Maritain's ideas, I wonder if you could give a short biography, particularly focusing on highlighting those parts of his life that informed his mature philosophy and his theological views, which I take to be important to his understanding of education.
Absolutely. Jacques Maritain was a French philosopher, born in France, obviously, to a nominally Catholic family, but not very practicing. Studied philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he met and married his wife, Raisa, who was a Jewish emigre from the Soviet Union. She fled the Bolshevik Revolution and settled in Paris. And together they were studying philosophy, and they considered themselves atheists. But they reached a point in their studies where they decided that if the claims of atheism were true, that there is no supernatural, there is no transcendent, there is no spiritual, then ultimately it would be rational to conclude that there is no meaning to the world and that life has no purpose. And they actually made a suicide pact that if they couldn't find an ultimate meaning to life, they couldn't see why they should go on. But they continued their search. And through reading some of the great French literature of the time and talking with French literary professors, they discovered, or in the case of Jacques Maritain, rediscovered the Catholic intellectual tradition. And were introduced to Thomistic philosophy, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and his great treatises on faith and reason, on nature and the supernatural, and they became committed Catholics. Raisa converting to Catholicism, Jacques, you could say, reverting. They lived in Europe, of course, during a very tumultuous time, as I already mentioned, the end of the First World War with the rise of the Soviet Union, the First World War, of course, in Germany, and the rise of Nazism in the Second World War. They were forced to flee France because of Raisa's Jewish roots. They were afraid for her life. And Jacques Maritain moved, and by that time he had become very well known, so it was easy for him to be given appointments as lecturers in philosophy. He spent time at the University of Notre Dame. He spent time teaching philosophy in Princeton University. And in 1942, he delivered the Terry Lectures, which have been published in a book called Education at the Crossroads. This is not his most well-known work. Jacques Maritain is probably most well-known for his work on political theory, the person and the common good. He's known for developing ideas around what he would call integral humanism. So as a philosopher, he was very interested in human experience and in phenomenology, right? And a basic understanding of how we make our way through the world. But he was trying to link what's good about humanism and phenomenology and the study of human experience with the timeless truths of tradition and with the idea that human experience is partially, individual, but also participating in a world that is imbibed with meaning, right? So Maritain in the United States continued to write and to teach. He was actually sent by the French government to serve in the Vatican after the end of World War II. He helped in many ways the Catholic Church to find its place in post-war Europe, to reconfigure the understanding of religion and politics. And he was incredibly interested in what does it mean to form human persons to participate in societies based upon political and religious freedom.
Very good. One of the sharp disagreements between Dewey and Maritain concerns their competing conceptions of human nature. Remember, the last session was on the problem of nature. For Maritain, what is the nature of the human person is central to his questions of his view of education. In your book, you describe his thinking this way, and I quote from your book, The Love of Learning. Maritain says that we can't understand the end of education if we don't ponder the meaning of the human person as merely, I'm going to start that again. Maritain says that we can't understand the end of education if we don't ponder the meaning of the human person as not merely a physical being, but created for knowledge and love as ends in and of themselves. Education has to first and foremost form the inner dynamism of the student, end quote. Can you unpack the meanings found here?
Absolutely. In his book, Education at the Crossroads, Maritain starts off chapter 1 by laying out common misconceptions about the end of education. And the first misconception, he says, is actually the neglect of the question, right? That very often debates around education and education policy focus on how we educate, not on who is the human person. Maritain, now in the Thomistic tradition, a kind of philosophy that's very attuned to tight definition of concepts, he provides in the Terry Lectures a definition of the human person. As I mentioned in our prior conversation about Dewey, one is left to deduce from Dewey what he thinks a human person is by means of what he's excluding or what he's remaining silent on. Maritain does not remain silent on the nature of a human person. He provides a definition. In Education at the Crossroads, Maritain writes, quote, "A person is an animal endowed with reason, whose supreme dignity is in the intellect, and man as a free and individual in personal relation with God, whose supreme righteousness consists in voluntarily obeying the law of God, and man as a sinful and wounded creature called to the divine life and to the freedom of grace, whose supreme perfection consists of love." Maritain, because he's a philosopher in the Thomistic tradition, uses every one of those words in that definition of the human person in a very deliberate sense. His choice of words is extremely important. So he says, we're an animal endowed with reason, right? Our nature has been given to us, and our dignity lies in our intellect and our ability to come to know ourselves as we are. And then he goes on to say that we come to know ourselves through freedom in relationship with God. So our freedom is not a kind of autonomy from any limitations of nature, or autonomy from any being, as Dewey would have put it. But no, our freedom is a relation with our Creator God. So therefore, the final end, the perfection of the human being, consists in voluntarily, right? In coming to know and obey the laws of God written in our heart about who we are. And he acknowledges, again, referring to what I said, the Max Shaler's conception of the human person as a mythical, religious person created for greatness, but we're fallen and we're wounded. In spite of that fallenness, we are called to a kind of perfection that consists of love, right? So again, this definition is different than Dewey, who doesn't have he doesn't provide a single clear definition, but it is clear from Dewey's progressive philosophy that these ideas of sinful woundedness just simply those are relics of the past that we don't need, right? We are, for Dewey, humans, we are creatures who make things. Whereas for Maritain, the most important thing he's trying to point out is that we're creatures who are given a certain kind of nature and given the capacities of the intellect to develop our knowledge freely, but in accordance with their rightful ends.
You talked about his definition of freedom as tied to his view of human nature, and you stress that properly understood freedom is relational, right? Particularly with God. And this led you to make a claim about love. And the title of your book is The Love of Learning. Love seems to be a theme in much of the literature about education, particularly at least into the modern era. I don't know if Dewey ever put it in those terms or ever used this category, but I'm put in mind of Socrates even, who used the term eros to talk about that yearning to be complete, a kind of love that hungers for something outside of oneself to complete one, right? And there are certain Christian versions of that, and in much philosophy, but also in much educational thought. I wonder if you could talk a bit about this concept of freedom he operates with. If education is to form us to be free, could you sketch out a bit more of what that is, and then what, if anything, does that have to do with love? And what does love mean in this context?
Well, I initially came to study Jacques Maritain not because of what he wrote about education, but because, as I mentioned earlier, because of his political philosophy. And given what he had lived through in Europe, and also he worked a lot in Latin America, trying to help the Latin American nations develop a political theory post-independence from Spain. So he cared very much about the human person as a social and political animal. And what I found so fascinating in his works on political theory, such as The Person and the Common Good, is that drawing on a lot of insights of what, broadly speaking, have been called personalist philosophers, he cared deeply about human subjectivity, both as having a dimension of our relation to God, but also having a depth of relation to the other person, right? So what, largely speaking, Maritain's trying to do when he talks of love is talk about our communion, our relationality with other people, not simply in a functional sense of solidarity towards some kind of material or social end, but as a bond, as an intrinsic valuing of the worth of the other person simply because they are also a person endowed with a created nature and freedom. The reason I found this so appealing, and the reason I think my students find it so appealing, is again referring back to John Dewey, who we talked about in the first lecture, right? Where does the progressive vision of the person as always doing things and always creating things, how does that fit with somebody who maybe has a physical disability or with somebody who has an intellectual disability? How does that help us understand the sense that the bonds we form with other people have a kind of eternal nature that are not bound by our physical existence or not, right? So when we talk of love, is the love that we feel for our children a tool that gets us to invest our time and energy in making them productive citizens in the world? Or is that love a participation in an eternal reality because we are created by an eternal, loving creator, God? I think Maritain would say the latter. But when I began to teach Aristotle and Maritain and compare it to the progressive philosophy or perhaps pragmatist philosophy, students began to identify that maybe implicitly they had been taught to value other people because of what they can do for them, not because of who they are. So again, Maritain as a Thomist philosopher is going back to an idea of the person as having a created reality. Like think of Psalm 138. You knit me in my mother's womb. You know my rising and my standing, right? That from our conception, from our inception as human beings, we have a soul that's in relation to a creator God. And that relation exists beyond our material existence. And so for Maritain, love has this transcendent quality. And it's this transcendent quality of love that allows us to get out of the prison, in some ways, of the buffered self. The idea that myself is an individual biological unit. No, Maritain is saying, of course we're individuals, but we participate in a shared commonality of love. And so our supreme goodness for Maritain is learning to make a gift of ourself to others in love. Because our nature itself, the fact that we're creatures, we are created in love by a loving God. And so we're called to imitate that self-giving love in our relationship with others. And that self-giving love is more important. It is the essence of our identity, not the material things that we create. Not that Maritain had any disdain at all for the scientific, the practical, the technical. Not by any means was he saying that. But he's saying, along with the Greeks and with the ancient philosophers and theologians, that we have a higher calling. We have a calling that surpasses the material world, even while and as we participate in the material world and in the political world.
Yeah, I'm pleased that you've highlighted what seems to me to be so central to his thinking, that we are relational beings, and we participate in society, we participate in others, we also participate in a reality we did not create, and that all of those connect to a certain Christian concept of love that I think that we might contrast later with a non-Christian understanding of love that comes in one of our other thinkers. Let's go back to a contrast with Dewey that I think is crucial. We could call Dewey a pragmatist or an instrumentalist, and emphasize that Dewey stressed our ability to adjust to environment, and education as a means of equipping us to adjust to our environment. That seems to be much of his focus. If he is an instrumentalist or a pragmatist, we might call Maritain, as you have suggested, a Christian realist. And therefore, his focus is less upon education as knowledge that leads to adjusting to the environment, although that's not prohibited, as you noted. The love of a wide array of knowledge that we can usually call scientific and practical in a certain kind. But instead, he seems to be focused on the structure of reality and the way in which a person fits into that reality. Education seems to be with this understanding of not that which is always changing, which is important in certain parts of our inquiry, but the part of us that doesn't change, which we call reality, and finding our place in that reality. Is this distinction an accurate one that between the two of them, and what does it indicate about the different directions their views of it, their philosophies of education would take us?
Mm-hmm. Well, in education at the crossroads, right, Maritain is explicitly in dialogue with John Dewey in several parts. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Maritain's ultimate end is to form human persons in a way that allows them to use knowledge in a way that furthers the human good. So Maritain writes that the aim of education is to guide man in the evolving dynamism through which he shapes himself as a human person, armed with knowledge, strength of judgment, and moral virtues, while at the same time conveying to him the spiritual heritage of the nation and the civilization in which he is involved, and preserving in this way the century-old achievements of generations. Now, having discussed Dewey's philosophy of education, this quote, I think, stands out very clearly as distinguishing Maritain from Dewey, because he says that we need to preserve centuries-old achievements of generations. And we need to convey to new generations the heritage of their civilization and of the nation in which they participate. So Maritain, like Dewey, absolutely valued us as political animals, as belonging to a community, as serving that community. But he thought we couldn't serve that community or participate in that community unless we understood the traditions and the knowledge being handed on to us. So, but again, this definition of the aim of education is so powerful because Maritain by no means is neglecting. In fact, he's upholding what he calls the evolving dynamism, right? The end of education is to shape the evolving dynamism within the human person. Well, what does he mean by that, right? What he's saying is that what education is supposed to do is not supposed to form people in habits, right? But to form their conscience and their power of judgment. And for Maritain, you can't make judgments about how to act right and wrong in the world without knowing things, but also without having an awakened and a formed moral conscience. So you need virtue. The intellectual virtues for Maritain require the moral virtues.
Yeah, I wonder if you could clarify, because I don't believe in Dewey. There's a discussion of virtue that I recall, at least not in the way in which the liberal arts would have talked about virtue. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what Maritain's understanding of the intellectual virtues are and what they're for, and then see if you could circle back to how they might be related to the moral virtues.
Well, I don't believe John Dewey would have spoken about virtues because, as I mentioned, Dewey is trying to develop an ethics that's not coming from a metaphysics. So Aristotle using the term virtue as a connection of our interior dispositions with our external actions. And so the term virtue would not be something that appeared in much of modern philosophy because it's trying to get away from metaphysics. Of course, in the famous book, After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre, he presents an entire critique of the end, in some ways, of modern philosophy, trying to construct ethical propositions and form sound judgment without referring to virtue. That's why he calls it After Virtue. And MacIntyre concludes that either we go back to Aristotle's understanding of virtue or we embrace Nietzschean nihilism, that there is no meaning and purpose, and therefore there can't be virtue because there is no such thing as meaning and purpose. And as I mentioned, Maritain himself was really preoccupied with this, right? Why shouldn't Maritain have become a Nietzschean, right? Why should we believe in the good if there's no fixed human nature? All there is kind of a will to power. We act in the world, but there's no measure by which we act other than its effectiveness. Effective for what? So it's become sort of circular in Dewey. So Maritain is trying to provide a grounding or return to a grounding for ethics by pointing to human nature. And so hence the term intellectual virtue and moral virtue means the perfection of a quality that we're endowed with at our creation, right? So we're given the capacity to know, and we're given the capacity to make moral judgments, but we have to be formed in using that capacity towards its proper end. Because, again, especially it's very clear with Maritain's understanding of the human person, that we're fallen and that we can use knowledge and all of our faculties for ends of destruction, right? So Maritain really cared about forming people who were going to use human capacities for good and not for bad. Dewey seems to presume that if we can create the right kinds of schools and social conditions, then this ancient concern about human nature being tainted by sin that leads us to have evil inclinations will simply just go away.
Yeah, I wonder if we need virtues, the virtues, because of our fallenness and because of our capacities, as you mentioned. We are born with capacities. And virtues are habits or other means by which we cultivate those capacities. I wonder if Maritain would say that it's impossible, given that we're fallen and given that we have these capacities, whether it's possible to live a good life without these virtues. And thus the necessity of education as a means of cultivating these virtues.
I don't see how for Maritain you could live the good life without virtues. In fact, I would say that rather than, as we discussed in the first session, growth for growth's sake, I would say that for Maritain, the understanding of the virtues, the cardinal virtues, the sort of theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, the supernatural virtues, the virtues that shape our relationship to God, as well as the primary human virtues, right? Prudence, right action, courage, right? Not only knowing the right thing, but doing the right thing, right? Prudence, courage. In fact, these human virtues like prudence and courage are present in every major philosophical and religious tradition. They're not unique to Christianity. Almost every philosophical system has a word to describe courage. Well, courage doesn't make sense unless you think that there's a moral core to the person that could choose to do something wrong, right? So for Maritain, it is of primary importance to live the virtuous life, because the virtuous life is both the fulfillment of one's personal good, but it's also how we contribute to the common good. And I think what then Maritain says in his book, Education at the Crossroads, he makes this point that education is broader than schooling, right? He makes this point that he's using education really in three different senses. And in the most basic sense, he's using the word education to mean any process that leads us to use our capacities in the way that they're intended to be, anything that helps us develop as human beings. So this is important because I think we can become good moral persons without, 15, 18 years of education or schooling in that sense. I'm just saying that for Maritain, this possibility of being educated is not the same as completing a certain amount of school. He also thinks that the term education means general instruction provided by adults to the young. But again, that instruction doesn't only happen in schools. It also happens in families. It happens in communities of faith. And it also happens in civic life, right? A third understanding of the very word of education is then the specific role of schools and universities, which Maritain does have a lot to say, about which to say. But I wanted to point out the contrast here with Dewey, for whom education is schooling, because schooling is how we get to the social, where for Maritain, education is multifaceted, and it occurs in the home, it occurs in civil society, it occurs with anything that leads us to properly use our human faculties. Now, he has thoughts about what the specific role of schools and universities are, and he certainly believes that it's important to have schools and universities that preserve knowledge from the past and help us engage in scientific inquiry and intellectual inquiry that move knowledge forward. He absolutely believes in schools and universities, but he's concerned about education becoming uniquely associated with what goes on in classrooms.
I'm fascinated by this because as you were speaking of his understanding, I kept running through my head the advertisements I hear from universities as they attract students. And I find that they often have two themes. One is that you come here, we'll give you the power to change the world. So it's that power. We're going to empower you to do something that is wrong, to change the world that's wrong about the world. And the other one is that you're going to have access to a sort of unbounded opportunities because you've come here. And implied in all that are concepts of freedom, that you are going to be a free person because you have these powers. If I understand what you're saying about Maritain, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you cannot be free without virtue. That freedom is necessary, that virtue is a necessary condition for freedom properly understood. And that non-virtuous people are by definition not free. And therefore, one of the purposes of education is to, in fact, give you freedom in the sense of giving you the virtues that make it possible to structure your life to know who you are and how to live well as who you are. If that's true, and tell me if I've erred in my analysis, if that's true, then the promises of the universities are not, as they suggest, about freedom, but about enslavement. If the goal is just to give you power to do something that you want to be a producer, to be a creator of something, but it neglects the very conditions that make you fully formed and to cultivate the capacities that are given to you by God, then in fact those universities are preparing you for something other than freedom.
Well, again, writing in 1942, Maritain warned that one of the potential effects of an overly pragmatic view of education is that it becomes enslaved to trends, right? So to the extent that we have schools and universities, Maritain wanted those schools and universities to in some ways stand outside of the latest political current or the most recent increase in jobs in a particular sector, right? He wanted education in terms of schools and universities to pass on knowledge that's timeless and prepare morally virtuous, educated people to participate in whatever part of society their personal vocation is calling them to. So he's concerned that curricula or university policy not be overly trying to predict the future or a priori determine what kinds of skills will be most valuable. You know, in some of his work on integral humanism, where he looks at, again, turning back to some of his political philosophy, he talks about the hubris of thinking because we know a lot that we know exactly where we stand in this moment in history. And therefore knowing exactly not only how to teach the young about timeless things, but how to tell them what their role is going to be, right? He's concerned that one of the misconceptions of education is that it becomes too political, that it becomes an arm of the state, that it becomes an arm of a political project. And this had disastrous consequences in communist Russia and in Nazi Germany. They had very effective educational systems in the scientific, technological, military concept of that term. But education became subjugated to a political project. Schooling and universities did. And so Maritain is again speaking to the United States of America in the midst of the Second World War. He's specifically addressing people in a nation founded on the ideals of freedom and the democratic republic system of government. And he is saying, in order for your great experiment in human freedom and democratic government to survive, you must protect schooling from becoming a political project. That's all about altering the today.
Have we?
I would say if Maritain were alive today, he would probably echo his warning, which maybe is what I'm doing, I think that universities and even schools at the K to 12 level, not all, but in many cases, have come to see that in order to be important or to fulfill their duty, they must take political stances in an overt sense, such as by writing, letters or making political pronouncements. And my concern is that we need to have education in schools and universities that are focusing on what I think Maritain is calling us to focus on, which is the development of the moral character of young people. I have participated in seminars where people propose that we don't do moral development of children. We write children's books with political activist themes. And I think what Maritain would say, and I would echo this, is like, no, that's not the role of schools. The role of schools is to form that inner dynamism of the child, of course, to make moral judgments, but not to tell them what the right and wrong answers are, but to give them the capacities of right judgment. Because, again, if we don't do that, Maritain says, we can habituate people to playing the right role as a protagonist in some kind of social or political movement. But that can be so easily warped for an end that goes beyond what the promoters of those programs might wish. So Maritain, again, in his definition of the human person and his definition of education, is saying that the role of education in schooling and the role of teachers is to form a human person armed with knowledge, prepared in virtue, to participate in society, but not to give a political program to education.
I think I'm more willing than you to suggest that our various systems of education have failed Maritain's plea, and that I find very little in our systems that are faithful to his call. Therefore, making him more of a prophet in some ways that we need to return to. But I want to turn to one of my favorite parts of your book, which talks about where Maritain's use of the term poetic knowledge comes up. He describes poetic knowledge. You describe, actually, in your book, poetic knowledge as, quote, the means of understanding the creative intuition that emanates from the soul of a person. Means of understanding the creative intuition that emanates from the soul of the person, end quote. This is rather foreign to modern ears. Poetic knowledge, or poetry more generally, seems connected to a kind of knowledge found in the immediacy of experience, and is therefore accessible to everybody. We all have experience. I wonder if you could explore this kind of knowledge and its importance a little bit here, but I'm particularly interested in a claim made by one of your dialogue partners in the book, George Harn. And he says this: there is an irreducible dimension to poetry. I love that word, irreducible, here. And if you could explore that a bit, that would be great too. There is an irreducible dimension to poetry, as there is to life. We want students to recognize through liberal learning that sometimes you cannot cross all the T's and dot all the I's. There are parts of life that are irreducible in their complexity. The process of understanding life is always unfinished. Poetry can prepare us to encounter the mysterious in our life, and it can inoculate us against certain ideologies that claim to explain and control everything. That's, end quote, that's from George Harn. I think it's a wonderful passage. Can you explore poetic knowledge and what is meant by this irreducible dimension of life? Why also should we embrace mystery rather than ideology?
Well, another one of Maritain's misconceptions about education that he lays out in Education, Crossroads, he says that not everything can be learned. Well, what does that mean? Why would a book on education say that not everything can be learned? I think what Maritain's alluding to, and what the quote you just read from George Harn is alluding to, is that as human beings, we come to know things by participating in them. That not everything can be learned in the sense that not everything can be taught in a curriculum. That there's aspects of being human and there's aspects of reality that we come to know because we participate in them. So part of the reason that music is part of the classical quadrivium in the liberal arts, part of the reason that George Harn is a first-generation college student, went on to study music and get a PhD in music, is that music is a way that we understand all of reality. It's not simply about appreciating the beauty of sound, but rather about music forming us in a way that Maritain calls poetic knowledge to perceive the fullness of reality. So for Maritain, he wrote later in life, he had written earlier, not too long after his conversion to Catholicism, he had written a short essay actually, called Art and Scholasticism, because Maritain had an enduring interest in literature and poetry and fine arts, music, painting. Towards the end of his life, in fact, the last long major work he wrote was called Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. And it was a series of lectures given at the National Galleries of Art in the 1950s. And that's where he develops and refines his ideas about poetic knowledge. And what he says is that poetic knowledge is different from conceptual knowledge, like the law, right? That's like a set of principles by which we should govern ourselves. And it's also different from mystical knowledge, where we have sort of a direct experience of God. Of course, he thinks conceptual knowledge and mystical knowledge are very important. But for Maritain, poetic knowledge was communication between the soul and the world. So Maritain very much wanted to situate poetic knowledge as part of the practical intellect. But he means practical in a very different way than Dewey. He means practical as a sense in which those intuitions, those intimations, those desires of our soul work themselves out through action in the world. And we do something practical in the sense that we create something that didn't used to exist, whether that be a work of art or poetry or a building, some sort of technical skill. And then we look back on it and think about how we might perfect it, right? So poetic knowledge, when you create, for example, a boat, right? The first people who made boats made a boat and then they reflected on whether or not it did what they wanted to do and they, change it and improve it. But for Maritain, poetic knowledge recovers this idea that the soul is known in the experience of the world and the world is known in the experience of the soul. Again, those sound like just a lot of words, but ask yourself, has there been some time when you have been moved by an experience of beauty or a feeling, an intuition that there's a totality, that there's a wholeness to the world? And Maritain wants to argue that it's this creative intuition and this poetic knowledge that we perceive that what we're creating and who we are participates in something big, in this wholeness, but that we have a vocation to work that out in the world. So he's trying to distinguish our action in the world as not simply being reactive to external stimuli or even satisfying these basic needs of food or power, or reproduction, but saying that we have not only, passions, but we have a heart, a center, where all of our actions and passions come together. And it's that creative intuition, that poetic knowledge becomes kind of, he calls this the spiritual pre-conscious, right? And he's trying to distinguish it from Freudian psychology or from postmodernism, and trying to ground the self as having this core that's integrated mind, body, and spirit, and where the practical and the contemplative kind of come together in this experience of the totality.
So much about this I want to understand better. Everything from the way in which music can function to help us understand reality and life, to this discussion of intuition and poetry. I want to push a little bit deeper into because I'm still a little unclear about what poetic knowledge means. I think I have a grasp on it, but not a deep grasp. And you connect it with intuition, or he connects it with intuition. Am I correct about that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm struggling here. So tell me if I'm running in the wrong direction. But there's something about the way in which real poetry, a poem, can find a way of capturing something in words that a syllogism can't, or that other more declaratory statements can't capture. It captures something of the complexity that is irreducible, to use that word again, and that it puts me in mind of another quote from Eric Voegelin that some truths come to us in the form of a mystery. And when truths come to us in the form of a mystery, what we do is we try to give expression to the mystery itself, to the architecture of that mystery, to the shape it has, because that's what we're trying to explore. We're not trying to solve the mystery, we're trying to understand the mystery, which is a different enterprise. So have I captured part of this so there's something about us that has an intuition about many things, presumably, and that the attempt to give it expression and to understand it requires it to take forms that science, as we understand that word at least, can't provide, right? But poetry, music, these are not only attempts to give an account for some experience, but also to explain in its own way experience that can't be explained or can't be given an account for in any other way. Have I captured that?
Yeah, I think that the notion of poetic knowledge I go into the most in depth with is with the scientist in my book, Carlo Lanciolotti, the mathematical physicist, right? So poetic knowledge isn't only, as we talk about in that chapter, isn't only writing poems, but it's starting with the premise that the human being, as you mentioned, has an irreducible depth that's participating in a mystery of reality, and that the things we make in this world, whether they be objects of art or scientific objects, are in some ways, actually in many ways, as Lanciolotti describes, the engine of human creativity isn't the scientific experiment. It's the human person capable of conceiving of something that does not yet exist, but might possibly exist. Again, whether that be a work of art or a motorcycle.
And some people use the word imagination to capture part of that the imaginative is that which is somehow capable of integrating the part with the whole which is intuited, and the part which we may actually experience in some direct way.
Right, and remember what I said in the discussion on Dewey. He doesn't believe that there's a fundamental underlying total principle that unites all things in nature, right? So what ends up becoming, again, why is all this relevant for education or for the human good? Well, the progressive view of the human person, the progressive view of education is constantly reforming and constantly transforming. Maritain's warning is that can become prey to trends. And although progressivism says we're supposed to be open to scientific innovation, it ends up squashing the very principle of that innovation, which is human creativity, which has this capacity to imagine the whole and then develop in the world a part of where that belongs. But the difficulty I see with pragmatism or progressivism is that it lacks an integrative principle where the things that we create in the world don't by definition, necessarily all come together in any fashion. And Maritain is trying to say, no, there is a unity to all of reality, and that human beings have this capacity at the same time to create a particular thing that works in the world, to imagine how all of that fits into this larger whole. But the openness for Maritain, as you mentioned, is a mystery. Not a mystery in the sense of unknowable or unattainable, but rather we move towards knowledge, we approach certainty, but every time we get to certainty, there's more questions to be asked. Right? So from Maritain's view of education is that we need to preserve the kinds of settled knowledge, that the conclusions that we've reached, and the curriculums of schools and universities need to present to students that centuries-old achievements of knowledge and use that as the basis for future exploration. Because he's concerned that the progressive view of education could end up destroying civilization, which is what happened in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. So this is a very real concern. And I think it is a concern for us today in the United States. Now, 60 years, 1942 to almost 2022, that's a little bit more than 60 years, more like 80 years, right? 80 years fast forward. What are we saying when we say that the mission of the university is not to preserve past tradition, but it's only to generate political subjects or relevant? We have to be careful that that spirit and that energy of being relevant doesn't get misused in a destructive way.
Yeah, I echo that concern, I would send us back to the fissure I said, separating two views of education based upon two views of human nature, and suggest what I will consider a warning. Maritain's discussion of what it means to be human and what it means to embrace this poetic knowledge, this imaginative quality, this rejection of ideology, sends him back to a claim of an expansive and I think quite beautiful view of humans, and in the context of a reality to which they belong. The other side of this, the thing to which he's responding, is a reductive view of the human. It is that ontological eclipsing that's going on. What does it mean to be human? And that view, that other view that Dewey and others tends in a direction that I think we find evidence of today. I heard on NPR about 10 years ago, for instance, a doctor saying, well, all humans are sacks of rapidly degenerating amino acids, which of course is an accurate description of humans, but hardly an adequate one, right? But I find that reductive, this desire to simplify. This is all we are. We're just organisms in Dewey's vision. We're just organisms adjusting to environment. We're organisms with certain qualities of reason and other kinds of problem-solving capacity, but we're just organisms. That I take to be an extremely a dangerous trajectory, making it possible for us to extinguish people, whether they are unborn or whether they are the defectively born or whatever other categories we have, because that view of human. That goes back to this question about how do we educate our children, and I wonder if it's not fair to contrast this poetic knowledge at the core of a certain kind of knowledge crucial to human flourishing for Maritain, and what I will call a kind of modern species of Gnosticism. This view that knowledge will save us, and the kind of knowledge necessary to save us is that reductive knowledge, the kind of thing that doesn't need, in fact, rejects tradition, rejects kind of knowledge that comes of that form, rejects beauty and all the rest of that as being irrelevant to the kind of knowledge we can use to change things to fit our desires. That kind of Gnosticism, which is, I think, a code word for ideology. Right? Is it fair to contrast those two things, a poetic knowledge, with modern Gnosticism?
I think the concept of poetic knowledge is trying to take account of our nature as embodied creatures, as well as creatures who see a symbolic meaning, right? That we're not purely creatures that are intending to use our knowledge as a form of power to manipulate, dominate other objects in the world, including other persons as objective, rather seeing persons as endowed with an objectivity and a deep subjectivity. So what Maritain says in his second chapter of Education at the Crossroads, he tries to take his educational philosophy down to, I would say, a very practical question of what's the role of the teacher, right? We mentioned that for Dewey, the role of the teacher is essentially to set the conditions for an experiment. And then the student's inner dynamism just is set free, right? So for Dewey, the freedom is freedom from external constraints. Give the right conditions and the student will develop. Maritain sees the pupil and the student, the student and the teacher as both having this dynamic inner life. So what Maritain says is that educators have a kind of authority that's a moral authority. I don't see that for Dewey. Teachers are facilitators. They don't have a moral authority. And what I've also seen with my own students, this is very clearly echoed in Maritain, students learn the most from teachers who love their subjects and love their students. Again, we get back to this word love that we started with, right? It's not a kind of dry passing on of information that can be subjected to some kind of a quantitative measurement of how well you've assimilated this kind of knowledge, right? So again, the progressive idea of education ends up becoming stifling of individuality because it lacks this kind of inner dynamism of the student. Maritain actually says that the teacher helps awaken the desire in the student by being a kind of by providing a kind of comforting assurance and a truly human personal gaze that's inexpressible either in concepts or words. And I'm encouraged by that statement to think that when I enter into a classroom, I'm passing on to my students not just the knowledge of a subject, but the very desire to know the truth and the love of the truth. And in my experience, students perceive deeply your own intention as a teacher and your own gaze towards them. And they're looking to follow people, right? True education is always personal. People follow people. We don't follow ideas, right? Again, if we go back to the classical understanding of teachers, magister, master, sitting at the feet of Socrates, listening, how did Jesus teach? People would gather around and listen and sit at his feet. Students are looking for teachers who believe that they have a certain kind of certainty and moral authority that they want to pass on, while also deeply respecting the individuality and the freedom of the student in front of them, right? So for Maritain, education has to foster unity. Therefore, education cannot be Gnostic. And he's very much concerned about schools focusing exclusively on one aspect of our humanity and therefore deforming all of our humanity. So if anything from Maritain is most relevant to our present day, and I believe we can continue this conversation when we go on to people like Paulo Freire and Luigi Giussani, it's again this question about the human person, rediscovering the integrated biological and spiritual nature of the human person is absolutely fundamental to any sound educational policy.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that from this point of view, education is a kind of soul craft, and the misuse of the word love is frequent in educational circles. But in this case, it must include the love of the student in the sense that one seeks to get the student in touch with their true selves. It's to send them back to what they really love, not to provide them with alternatives to what they love, some diversions or or power or knowledge that escapes their most central goal or central hunger, which is the hunger to know what is true. and ultimately to know God. Well, as we end this session and think about the next one, anticipate the next one, I would, drawing from my own experiences, suggest that my students believe themselves to be living in a false reality. Everything seems fake to them, or I should say untrue. They're unscripted because they don't have a touchstone of truth. They don't even have, in many cases, people pointing them to truth or telling them there is a truth. So Maritain's ideas might be appealing in the way that water is appealing to someone who's in the desert. So is Maritain relevant today, or is he more relevant today than he was in 42 because of our time? Do you have the same sense that students are hungry for the truth because they experience themselves to be living in something false?
A lot of students that I've worked with feel that we live in a desiccated culture, right? That what's been left to us through the legacy of a scientific worldview is the only things that are true are what can be stated through scientific experimentation. And all the rest, our normative concerns, our values, our religious creeds, they're all subjective and ultimately based on emotion, right? This was, of course, McIntyre's argument in After Virtue, that metaphysical truth, religious truth, moral truth has been reduced to the level of emotions rather than a kind of certainty. And I find that young students have begun to question that, and that they're longing for someone, for some proposal of a unity of life, for some proposal of a coherent way of living. And precisely Maritain, as you mentioned, his metaphor for education is more of an art or a craft, whereas for Dewey, metaphor for education is a scientific experiment. But for Maritain, as I've tried to emphasize, art and craft, it's a virtue of the practical intellect, meaning our ideas have to be worked out in practice. Whereas, ironically, progressive ideas remain at the level of ideas. And if they don't work, the response is often, well, we just haven't gotten the conditions right. And then it becomes an ideology because it becomes immune to critique, even based on its own principles, which is that it should work. And if it doesn't work, it's always the fault of someone else, or maybe we just need to keep reforming and we need to keep transforming. And so students have been, by the time they get to me, students have generally been through an education system that has been telling them to reform and change and to reform and change, and hasn't stopped to tell them what's stable, what's unchanging, what is the end to which your change is going to be oriented. So change for change's sake becomes not a way to develop what Maritain wants, which is a coherent, unified self.
Thank you so much, Margarita. This has been, there's so much more to talk about with Maritain, and I think we've just scratched the surface in some ways, but we're not done. We've talked about Dewey and we've talked about Maritain. And then our next session, we turn to someone who is quite different from Maritain and has had a profound influence in schools of education, particularly, Paulo Freire. And so when we come back to our next session, we'll have a chance to continue talking about Dewey and Maritain, but in the context of a revolutionary thinker, someone who's self-consciously a revolutionary thinker. So thank you so much for this. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ted.